Good evening, students. Tonight we're going to talk about the Cold War and the end of European empires. The term Cold War comes from the tense relationship that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union following the end of World War II. During this period, known as Cold War, which lasted from 1947 to about 1991, there were several what we would call low-intensity conflicts that occurred, which involved the Soviet Union and Western allies as either direct participants, like the Korean War, Vietnam War, or indirectly through client states like the Congo, Cuba, Greece, and Afghanistan. There were some major events during the Cold War that we could include in tonight's discussion. We won't talk about all of these, but just as an example, the Greek Civil War, the Berlin Airlift, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, the Korean War, the Suez Canal crisis, the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik, the launch of U.S. Satellite Explorer 1, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT 1 and 2, the Soviet invasion in 1979 of Afghanistan, Operation Urgent Fury, which was the U.S. invasion of Grenada, Glasnost, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. These are all seminal events in the Cold War. Keep in mind that although this course is about European history, the United States was heavily involved in the Cold War, so we'll look at its contribution. Churchill gave a famous speech in 1946 whereby he stated that an iron curtain is drawn upon their front. There are many reasons to which historians could point regarding what actually caused the Cold War, but it really began during what's called the Second Front issue in 1943. As we talked about last week, the Russians had been shouldering the brunt of battling the Nazis since June of 1941, and Stalin desperately wanted the Allies to invade Western Europe, particularly France, to relieve pressure from the Eastern Front. Churchill wanted to strike at what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, that is, Italy and the Balkans. The British were more interested in maintaining their political interests, and the preservation of the British Empire and taking the Mediterranean would accomplish this. On the other hand, Roosevelt's military advisors were pushing him for a cross-channel assault in keeping with the Rainbow Five or Germany First strategy. To show Stalin that the United States was committed to defeating the Nazis, Roosevelt agreed to launch Operation Torch in November of 42, but this really didn't satisfy Stalin because it really didn't draw that many German troops off the Eastern Front. Had the Allies gone with Churchill's strategy and neglected a cross-channel invasion, it's doubtful that the Soviets would have gained as much territory in Central and Eastern Europe as they ended up getting after World War II. There would have been no need, as an Allied approach via the Balkans would have immediately alienated the Russians. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, Churchill was basically overruled by Roosevelt, and planning for D-Day began. However, this Second Front controversy was an essential factor in the beginning of the Cold War because Stalin was allowed to drive through Central Europe into the heart of Berlin. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt agreed to require Germany's unconditional surrender and to set up in the conquered nation 4 zones of occupation that would be run by their 3 countries respectively, and France. They scheduled another meeting for April in San Francisco to create the United Nations. Stalin also agreed to permit free elections in Eastern Europe and to enter the Asian War against Japan, which they did on August the 9th, 1945, the same day that the Americans dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. In turn, Stalin was promised the return of lands lost to Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. At the time, most of these agreements were kept secret, though. The Yalta Conference became controversial as Stalin broke his promise of free elections in Eastern Europe and instead installed communist governments in the countries he conquered in his drive into Germany in 1943 to 45. These became known as the Eastern Bloc or the Warsaw Pact. American critics have since blamed Roosevelt, who died 2 months after the conference, that he sold out to the Soviets at Yalta. One of the more visible causes for the Cold War occurred after the occupation zones, which then divided Germany. In 1949, the Soviet-occupied eastern zone of Germany became the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, and the Allied zones became the German Federal Republic, or to make it simple, East and West Germany. Barbed wire minefields were placed to divide the zones, and these items reflected the ideological division existing between the East and the West. And then in 1961, the Berlin Wall was constructed, which became a more permanent form of division. Also in 1949, a military alliance was established by the Western Allies, which became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. And the purpose of NATO was to create a counterbalance to Soviet armies stationed in Central and Eastern Europe after World War II. The original members of NATO were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and of course the United States. And at the heart of NATO was the following proclamation, quote, "An armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. And consequently, they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area." Of course, when we think about NATO, we could compare that to the Triple Entente, the Tripartite Pact of World War II, because NATO was really a form of collective security against the global threat of communism. NATO also allowed the stationing of United States troops in European bases like England, West Germany, Portugal, and the Netherlands. And to this day, there are still U.S. bases that are there. I was stationed in Portugal for a period of 3 years in the early 1980s. Throughout the Cold War, each and every low-intensity conflict took on huge significance and caused great fear throughout the world because the United States was not alone in possessing the atomic bomb. Just really 4 years after World War II ended, the Soviet Union exploded their first atomic bomb in 1949, the same year Germany was officially divided. Great Britain got the bomb in 52, France got the bomb in 60, China in 64, and so on. So with the threat of global thermonuclear war hanging in the air, the Cold War threatened to become hot at a moment's notice. The first major conflict of the Cold War was the 3-year Greek Civil War. When German troops departed Greece after the end of World War II, there was a bloody civil war that ensued in 1946 between Greek communists and pro-monarchy forces. Russia began providing the communists with weapons and material assistance. The United States aided the monarchist forces who eventually prevailed in 1949. And really, the Greek Civil War set the stage for how the Cold War was going to be fought. Like pawns on a global chessboard, the Soviet Union and the United States fought wars by proxy through client states to achieve their aims. Following the Greek Civil War, the next major Cold War incident was the Berlin airlift. In 1948, Russian troops decided to blockade rail and truck routes into West Berlin that had to travel through Soviet zones of occupation. This meant that the people in West Berlin would not receive supplies. And in retaliation, the Allies began a massive airlift of supplies into West Berlin, flying over 200,000 flights in 1 year, providing to the West Berliners up to 9,000 tons of supplies each and every day. Soviet military aircraft began to violate West Berlin airspace and would harass, or what the military called buzz, supply flights that were going in and out of West Berlin. On 5 April 1948, a Soviet Air Force fighter collided with a British European Airways airliner, killing everyone on board both aircraft. And this was the only time during the airlift when tensions nearly escalated the war. On April the 15th, 1949, the Soviets announced that they were willing to lift the blockade. The next day, the U.S. State Department stated that, quote, "the way appears clear," end quote, for the blockade to end. Soon afterwards, the four powers began serious negotiations and a settlement was reached on Western terms. On May the 4th, 1949, the Allies announced an agreement and the blockade ended. Prior to the Berlin blockade, President Truman announced on March the 12th, 1947, in an address to Congress that it would be the foreign policy of the United States to assist any country whose stability was threatened by communism. And of course, this became known as the Truman Doctrine, and it effectively reoriented U.S. foreign policy away from its historical isolationist stance, as in not getting involved in regional conflicts, to one of possible intervention in faraway conflicts. The inspiration for the Truman Doctrine came from a diplomat that was named George Kennan, who outlined that the best defense against a Soviet threat was a strategy of what was called containment. So the Truman Doctrine effectively gave the job of world policeman to the United States. Eisenhower would build off the Truman Doctrine when he advanced his domino theory. In 1945, a civil war erupted between the nationalist Chinese government, led by a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, and the communist Chinese government led by Mao Zedong. And like we did during World War II, the U.S. backed Chiang Kai-shek's forces in their establishment in 1950 of a democratic government in what's now called Taiwan. On the Chinese mainland, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. And so since 1950, China has been a communist nation, and Truman took a lot of flack over the United States losing China to communism. Politically, this was a huge victory for the Soviet Union during the Cold War. One of the unfortunate outcomes of the Truman Doctrine was the hysteria over the perceived threat posed by communists residing within the United States. This became known as the Red Scare. Communists were often referred to as Reds for their allegiance to the red Soviet flag, as well as the Russian Civil War, the Reds and the Whites. The Red Scare led to a wide range of actions that had a profound and enduring effect on U.S. government as well as American society. Federal employees were analyzed to determine whether they were sufficiently loyal to the government, and the House Un-American Activities Committee, as well as U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy, investigated allegations of subversive elements in the U.S. government and the Hollywood film industry. On February the 9th, 1950, McCarthy claimed that he had a list with the names of over 200 members of the State Department that were known communists. The speech pushed McCarthy to national prominence and sparked a nationwide hysteria about subversive elements in the American government, and these became known as McCarthy witch hunts. McCarthy never did produce any concrete evidence that there were even one communist working in the State Department. In June 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. South Korean President Syngman Rhee appealed to the United Nations for help. The United Nations voted for a resolution calling for an immediate cessation of hostility and a withdrawal of communist troops back across the 38th parallel. The United Nations sanction gave the United States the green light to protect its own interests, and General MacArthur, who was commander of all Far Eastern forces, began sending ammunition and supplies to South Korean troops. Soon, U.S. troops arrived under the cloak of what was called the UN cloak. After 3 years of bitter fighting, an armistice was finally signed in July of 1953, leaving the division between North and South Korea pretty much the same as it was in June 1950. There were more than 3 million casualties in the Korean War, known as the Forgotten War, including 140,000 U.S. forces killed or wounded. The Korean War heightened the Cold War tensions not only in Europe but across the globe. In a 1950 New York Times article, Truman was quoted as saying regarding China's sending troops across the Yalu River that, quote, "We will use the atom bomb if necessary, and MacArthur would be allowed to pick the targets." Truman's threat of using nuclear weapons sent shockwaves around the world. After all, he had been the only world leader to have already used a nuclear weapon, and so it's not like there was not a precedent for making such a statement. Since Russia also had the atomic bomb, tensions between America and the Soviet Union mounted during the 50s and 60s. Fallout shelters sprang up in most institutional buildings like schools, gymnasiums, libraries, and those citizens who could afford it started to build their own private bomb shelters. In March 1953, Stalin suffered a stroke and died, and his replacement, Nikita Khrushchev, became the Soviet premier. During Operation Barbarossa, Khrushchev was responsible for moving all the industrial plants to the Russian interior to keep them from falling into the hands of the Nazis. In 1955, Khrushchev signed the Warsaw Pact, which was an answer to NATO. And like NATO, if any communist nation were attacked, Russia would come to her aid. And with the Warsaw Pact in place, Russia could station troops in Eastern Bloc nations like Poland and Hungary and East Germany. In the U.S. military, troops continued to focus their combat training for a European war, just like the one they had fought in World War II. And the deep battle doctrines of men like Tukhachevsky became the standard training for both Warsaw Pact and NATO troops. Ironically, Tukhachevsky was one of the brilliant Soviet minds that had been murdered during the paranoid Stalin purges. On May 25, 1953, 21,000 U.S. soldiers took part in a ground exercise involving the firing of a 280 millimeter nuclear-tipped artillery shell out of an M65 atomic cannon. This event was known as Shot Grable. The detonation occurred 19 seconds after firing, and it detonated over 11,000 yards away from the gun it was fired from, over a part of the Nevada test site known as Frenchman Flat. U.S. troops were instructed to jump into ditches, to close their eyes, and to wait for the blast effect to wash past them before jumping out of their trenches and advancing towards ground zero. In 1957, the Russians developed an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, and launched the world's first satellite into space, called Sputnik. This event started the race for space between the Soviet Union and the United States. A year later, the United States launched its own ICBM satellite known as Explorer 1. With the advent of ICBMs, NATO and Warsaw Pact leaders realized the strategic possibility of nuclear warfare. Prior to ICBMs, a nuclear weapon would have to be delivered from an airplane or an atomic cannon, like Shot Grable. But an airplane could be intercepted by other aircraft and shot down, and an artillery gun could be destroyed through conventional means. Therefore, the use of nuclear weapons was primarily limited to tactical usage. But with an ICBM, a nation could launch a nuclear weapon from within the confines of their own nation or from an allied nation. As a result, a nuclear arms race ensued, with each major power trying to one-up the other in stockpiles of nuclear weapons. With this race to develop a greater stockpile of nuclear weapons, this led in turn to an increase in espionage between American and Soviet operatives. The CIA and the KGB became rivals, locked in a struggle to gain the upper hand for their nation. There were three main features to the spying operations that took place during the Cold War. First, there was the collection of documents and evidence from the opposite side by spies. We would classify that as counterintelligence, covert operations, and so forth. Each side strove to gain the upper hand and to discover the secrets of the opposite side. In films and television, spies are often portrayed as glamorous individuals like James Bond, who lead fast-moving lifestyles, carry guns, and dress in cool clothes, and have exciting adventures, and so forth. In reality, however, this was far from the truth. Spies were often nondescript people who led ordinary lives. They didn't stand out from the crowd. They drew very little attention to themselves by design. They didn't want to draw attention to what they were doing, especially as they usually worked or had connections with a top secret workplace, such as a laboratory or some sort of government office. Counterintelligence was the effort of both sides to protect their agents, and this often involved laying false trails in an attempt to confuse the enemy. During covert operations, each side used their intelligence agencies to put pressure on their enemies and to support their allies. From the early years of the Cold War, Secrets played an important part, each side trying to gather information about the other while going to quite extraordinary lengths to protect their own secret agents. The key was the arms race. Each side wanted to know the pace of weapon developments that the opposition had achieved. Arguably, the most famous espionage case involved married couple Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The Rosenbergs were American citizens who spied for the Soviet Union and were tried, convicted, and executed by the electric chair for conspiracy to commit espionage. They were instrumental in the transmission of information about top secret military technology and prototypes of mechanisms related to the atomic bomb, which were valued to the Soviet nuclear program. Another aspect of the arms race was the proliferation of nuclear submarines. Nuclear-powered submarines began to be armed with ICBMs, which could launch from way out to sea, but miles beneath the ocean's surface. The Russian Akula-class boomer carried 20 ICBMs each, with a 200 kiloton warhead. By way of comparison, the bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima was an 18 kiloton warhead. And of course, this fostered the advent of cat and mouse submarine tactics used by the United States and Russians during the Cold War. Missile carrying subs were called boomers, and the subs designed to hunt them down were called hunter killers. Author Tom Clancy wrote one of the most famous works of fiction about this concept called The Hunt for Red October. I recall reading this book in 1986 while I was stationed in a NATO country overseas. Russian and U.S. subs would basically engage in underwater versions of chicken or blind man's bluff, in which one sub would ping another sub and then evade its sonar. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy approved a CIA-led invasion of Cuba to try to remove communist Fidel Castro from power because of the domino theory. Kennedy didn't want Cuba, that was right in our backyard, to become communist, and so he orchestrated a CIA-led invasion. Castro had turned Cuba into a communist satellite state in 1959, and this really hit close to home because Cuba is only 90 miles from Miami, Florida. So as of 1959, we had a communist nation right in our own backyard. The failed invasion was called the Bay of Pigs, and it utilized a group of Cuban exiles loyal to the former president of Cuba, a man by the name of Fulgencio Batista. The plan anticipated that the Cuban people and elements of the Cuban military would support the invasion once it was discovered that it was there. The ultimate goal was the overthrow of Castro and the establishment of a non-communist government friendly to the United States. The first mishap occurred on April 15, 1961, when obsolete World War II B-26 bombers, painted to look like Cuban Air Force planes, missed many of their targets and left most of Castro's Air Force intact. As news broke of the attack, photos of the repainted U.S. planes became public and revealed American support for the invasion. Of course, this embarrassed President Kennedy, and he canceled a second airstrike. On April the 17th, the Cuban exile invasion force, known as Brigade 2506, landed at the beaches along the Bay of Pigs and immediately came under intense heavy fire. Cuban planes strafed the invaders, sank 2 escort ships, and destroyed half of the exiles' air support. Castro ordered roughly 20,000 troops to advance toward the beach. Some exiles escaped to the sea, while the rest were either killed or rounded up and imprisoned by Castro's forces. Almost 1,200 members of Brigade 2056 surrendered, and more than 100 were killed. The brigade prisoners remained in captivity for 20 months as the United States negotiated a deal with Castro. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, made personal pleas for contributions from pharmaceutical companies and baby food manufacturers, and Castro eventually settled on $53 million worth of baby food and medicine in exchange for the prisoners. The Bay of Pigs had a lasting impact on the Kennedy administration, and determined to make up for the failed invasion, Kennedy initiated what was called Operation Mongoose, which was a plan to further sabotage and destabilize the Castro government. Feeling persecuted by Kennedy and the CIA, Castro reached out to Khrushchev who began installing SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. On October the 15th, 1962, a U-2 U-2 spy plane took photographs of missile sites in Cuba, and this began the, quote, 13 days, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy addressed the nation. He told Americans that Soviet nuclear missiles were aimed at our cities. He then laid out the details for a naval blockade. The U.S. Navy deployed 180 ships into the Caribbean, while Strategic Air Command loaded B-52 bombers with nukes. Kennedy then composed the first of several private letters to Khrushchev supporting the legal ramifications of the blockade. The Navy received precise instructions on how to intercept and board a Soviet vessel headed for Cuba. The Soviets in turn deployed attack submarines to protect their merchant vessels. Clearly, both sides were postured for a nuclear showdown. The question remained as to who would be the first to make the mistake of escalating the situation into a global catastrophe. Fortunately, for these two men with gigantic egos, a mild-mannered Burmese diplomat named U Thant, Secretary General of the United Nations, stepped in and saved the day by suggesting a Soviet missile withdrawal in exchange for Kennedy's guarantee that he would not invade Cuba and that the U.S. would remove antiquated missiles from Turkey. It worked, and the world was able to breathe again, thanks largely to the efforts of Mr. U Thant. After China fell to communism in 1949, the Soviets and Chinese formally recognized the legitimacy of Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam and began to provide military assistance to him. As a result, the U.S. increased its support for the French. And with the advent of the Korean War, the United States suspected a Soviet intent to turn all of Asia to communism, again, this being the domino theory. By February 1950, the Truman administration was financing 80% of France's costs in the Indochina War. Also, the United States was formally backing a man by the name of Bao Dai as the official government in South Vietnam. The final phase of the Indochina War culminated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in March of 1954. During the siege of Dien Bien Phu, French Chief of Staff General Paul Ely approached President Eisenhower for air support around the fortress. Eisenhower sought more concessions from the French and desired to turn the Indo-Chinese War into an international war because he warned of a domino effect should Dien Bien Phu fall into communist hands. That's exactly what happened. In May of 1954, the French surrendered, which ended any further argument, and the Geneva Accords partitioned the country of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam controlling the north and the Bao Dai government controlling the south. In June of 1954, Ngo Dinh Diem was invited by Emperor Dai to form a new government in South Vietnam. The Eisenhower administration saw this as an opportunity to build up non-communist forces in South Vietnam, thereby preventing Eisenhower's domino theory from happening. From that time forth, the United States poured billions of dollars into the Diem government, hoping to keep it from being overrun by the North. Shortly after assuming power in South Vietnam in 1959, Diem had begun a rule of terror, incarcerating thousands of peasant villagers into re-education centers. Diem also beheaded many of those same villagers. As a result, a marked increase in unrest and sympathy for the North intensified, and many South Vietnamese villagers sympathized with Ho Chi Minh in the North. These communist sympathizers organized themselves in the South into what was called the National Liberation Front, or better known as the Viet Cong. In an attempt to try to stop the spread of communism in the South, the United States began sending military advisors over in the 1950s to train South Vietnamese troops how to fight. The United States then sanctioned a coup and actually had Diem and his brother murdered 20 days before Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. This created a power vacuum in the democratic government of South Vietnam, and the United States saw it as her job to fix it. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson announced that the USS Maddox had been attacked off the coast of Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson blamed North Vietnam for the attack and used the incident to pass the Tonkin Resolution. This is another example of a false flag operation. The Tonkin Resolution granted President Johnson the authority to assist any Southeast Asian country whose government was considered to be jeopardized by communist aggression. The Tonkin Resolution served as Johnson's legal justification for deploying U.S. conventional forces and the commencement of open warfare against North Vietnam without a congressional declaration of war. For the duration of the Vietnam War, which lasted 10 years, the Soviets supplied, fed, and trained Viet Cong guerrillas as they fought U.S. troops. In 1973, U.S. troops officially pulled out under the Nixon administration, and Vietnam was lost to the Communists in 1975. More than 56,000 Americans died during the Vietnam War. In 1952, an Egyptian nationalist named Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew King Farouk and then demanded the British withdraw from the narrow zone along the Suez Canal, refusing to recognize the signed agreement between his government and England. The agreement basically stated that England would withdraw in phases but retained the right to send military aid should the canal be attacked by a Warsaw Pact nation. Nasser wanted to construct the Aswan Dam on the Upper Nile River, which he hoped would modernize the Egyptian economy. The situation further escalated in July of 1956 when the U.S. government withdrew its financial aid for the building of the dam on the Nile River due to Egyptian purchases of arms from Soviet bloc nations. In an effort to pay for the dam project, President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been owned by British and French shareholders. On September the 23rd, 1956, France and Britain requested that the United Nations resolve the matter in their favor based on the Suez Canal Convention of 1888. Egypt responded by saying that various powers, mainly France and the United Kingdom, were violating the UN Charter by their actions. While the Security Council passed a resolution on 13 October on how to resolve the crisis, Israel, France, and the United Kingdom secretly planned to invade Egypt. France became involved partly due to Egypt's continued support of insurgents in Algeria, while Britain's involvement resulted from the loss of control over the Suez Canal. Israeli forces began the invasion of Egypt on the morning of 29 October 1956. To resolve the crisis, the United Nations deemed it necessary to bring about the withdrawal of the occupation forces, alter the completion of the withdrawal process, and to establish a buffer zone between Egypt and Israel. One of the somewhat forgotten elements of the Cold War conflict was the 10-year-long quagmire in Afghanistan. In Christmas of 1979, Russian paratroopers landed in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. The country was already in the grip of a civil war. The prime minister tried to sweep aside Muslim tradition within the nation because he wanted a more Western slant in Afghanistan. And of course, this outraged the majority of the traditional Muslims in Afghanistan. Thousands of Muslim leaders had been arrested, and many more had fled the capital and hid in the mountains to escape the prime minister's secret police force. The prime minister also led a communist-based government, a belief that rejects religion, and this was another reason for such obvious discontent with his government. Thousands of Afghanistan Muslims formed an insurgent force against the prime minister called the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen wanted to overthrow the prime minister's government and declared a holy war, or a jihad, on the supporters of the prime minister. This was also extended to the Russians, who were now in Afghanistan trying to maintain the power of the prime minister's government. The Russians claimed that they had been invited in by the prime minister and that they were not invading the country. They claimed that their task was to support a legitimate government and that the Mujahideen were nothing more than terrorists. On December the 27th, 1979, the prime minister was shot by the Russians and was replaced by a man by the name of Kamal. His position as head of the Afghan government depended solely on Russian military support. Many Afghan soldiers had deserted to the Mujahideen, and the Kemal government needed more Russian soldiers to remain in power. The Mujahideen proved to be a formidable opponent. They were equipped with old rifles but had a knowledge of the mountains around Kabul and the weather conditions that would be encountered there. The Russians resorted to using napalm and poison gas, helicopter gunships against the Mujahideen, but they experienced nearly exactly the same military scenario that the Americans experienced in Vietnam. By 1982, the Mujahideen controlled 75% of Afghanistan despite fighting the might of the world's second most powerful military power. Young conscript Russian soldiers were no match against men driven by their religious beliefs. Though the Russian army had a reputation, the war in Afghanistan showed the world just how poor it was outside of military displays. Army boots lasted no more than 10 days before falling to bits in the harsh environment of the Afghanistan deserts and mountains. Many Russian soldiers deserted to the Mujahideen. Russian tanks were of little use in the mountain passes. America did something about this. During this war, America put a ban on the export of grain to Russia, ended the SALT talks, and then boycotted the Olympic Games that were due to be held in Moscow in 1980. Other than that, America did nothing. America knew Russia had gotten itself into their own Vietnam, and it also provided American intelligence with an opportunity to acquire new Russian military hardware that could be used in Afghanistan. Mujahideen freedom fighters were given access to American surface-to-air missiles. America also sent billions of dollars in weapons to the Mujahideen. Mikhail Gorbachev, the new premier of Russia, took Russia out of the Afghanistan fiasco when he realized what many Russian leaders had been too scared to admit in public, and that was that Russia couldn't win the war, and the cost of maintaining such a vast force in Afghanistan was basically crippling Russia's economy. When Russia finally pulled out in February of 1989, a power vacuum was created that was filled by an organization called Al-Qaeda, and it was led by a man that the United States helped during the war, a Mujahideen freedom fighter named Osama bin Laden. When Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet premier in 1985, he initiated changes known as perestroika and glasnost, or openness, which melted the rigid Soviet system and liberated 15 republics of the Soviet Union to become independent states. And this, of course, ended the existence of the United Socialist Republics, and this happened in December of 1991. Gorbachev's relationship with U.S. President Ronald Reagan was probably the most amiable one between the two nations. On June 12, 1987, Reagan appealed to Gorbachev to remove the Berlin Wall. Reagan's speech went like this, quote, "We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The tearing down of the Berlin Wall began the evening of November the 9th, 1989, and continued over the following days and weeks, with people nicknamed wall woodpeckers using various tools to chip off souvenirs, demolish lengthy parts of the wall in the process, creating several unofficial border crossings. Various military units dismantled the Berlin-Brandenburg border wall, completing the job in November 1991. The Soviet Union was formally dissolved on December 26, 1991, as a result of the Declaration number 142H of the Republics of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. The Declaration acknowledged the independence of the former Soviet republics and created the Commonwealth of Independent States. Although 5 of the signatories ratified it much later, or not at all, on the previous day, Gorbachev, the 8th and final leader of the Soviet Union, resigned, declared his office extinct, and handed over its powers including control of the Soviet nuclear launch codes, to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. That evening at 7:32 p.m., the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time and replaced with the pre-revolutionary Russian flag. Just in conclusion, I wanted to remind you that the quiz, your fourth quiz, is due tonight at midnight. So please don't forget that. As well, don't forget the final discussion board. Look forward to seeing you guys next Monday. Have a good night.